Welcome to the Love, Learn, Play podcast presented by the nonprofit organization Universal Enlightenment and Flourishing. Here we sit down with individuals who've dedicated their lives to helping others flourish to discuss the Love, Learn, Play mindset, which is UEF's simple framework for happiness and flourishing in life. You can find all of our podcast episodes at uef.org and follow us on social media at UEF Insights. My name's Alan. I'll be representing Universal Enlightenment and Flourishing, and in this episode, I'll be chatting with Nina Hirlaender, who is a Franciscan sister, a Christian mystic, teacher, co-owner of Dancing Spirit Tours, and much more. Nina's a dear friend with an inspiring story of spiritual discovery in the midst of illness and a recovery process that ultimately led toward a life built around love, learning, and play, a renewed sense of flourishing, and the pursuit of a calling to help others flourish. So thank you for being here, Nina.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, so you're a Franciscan sister, meaning you follow in the tradition of Saint Francis, who I think is a tremendous exemplar of love, learn, and play. So what do you think of when you think of Saint Francis? And are there particular Franciscan creeds or practices that you think focus deliberate attention on loving, learning, and playing?
I love this question. It's a good one to start with. Well, I think when most people picture Francis, they see a little gentle garden statue with a bird resting on his shoulder. And
Yeah.
that's such a sweet image, but it's almost a kind of disguise
Hmm.
because the real Francis was wild and unruly. He very much took the gospel literally, so literally that it unsettled the entire institution of the Catholic Church, which was the most powerful entity of the 13th century. So when I think of Francis, the first word that comes to me is freedom. And he became free by letting go of everything that the world around him told him to hang on to. For those of you that don't know a little bit about Francis, Francis was born wealthy. He was the son of a rich cloth merchant, and he grew up with all these fine clothes and parties and very much lived a life of comfort. And there's a famous story in his life that his father drags him in front of the bishop and the whole town of Assisi. And Francis strips off every piece of clothing that he's wearing right there in the public square until he's standing there in front of the entire town completely naked. And he folds his clothes neatly and he sets them in a pile at his father's feet. And it's very famous, this story, because, well, it's dramatic, but it's also the most literal picture of self-emptying that you can imagine.
Hmm.
Because he really walked out of that square owning nothing. And it was then that it was the first time really in his life that he belonged entirely to himself and entirely to God. And Francis found that freedom in a concept that most of us spend our whole lives avoiding, which is that everything that you own in some way owns you back. So every
Wow.
possession is something that you have to protect and worry about losing. And every bit of status that we gain in life, at school, in our work, is something that we have to keep defending. And the more we accumulate, the more of our attention has to go against guarding it all. So when Francis let go of all of it, he didn't do it because all these things are evil. He did it because he wanted his hands and his heart to be completely open. And he had nothing left to protect. So he had nothing left to fear. He let go of, his family and his father's plans for him and his image of himself. And he became free. And that freedom is the core value of Franciscans. And the order still stands by it today. And Francis had a different name for it. He called it poverty. But what it really is availability. Because a person carrying nothing can respond to anything. And I think that's the part that translates most directly to our modern lives today. Because most of us, we miss those promptings, not because we don't hear them, but because we're so weighed down by our schedules and our accumulation of wealth and our degrees. We're so weighed down by these things that we don't act on those inner promptings. So, yeah, you feel a nudge to call a friend. You've been thinking about them, but you talk yourself out of it because you're busy. Or you pass a homeless person on the street who clearly needs help, but we've numbed ourselves and it's so inconvenient to notice them, so we just ignore them. And this availability that Francis stood for is keeping yourself light enough that when the moment comes, you can actually say yes to it.
I love that. It's interesting. There are a number of themes there that are kind of reminding me of some of the recent conversations I've had with other people on this podcast. And of course, you're a podcaster yourself as well, which comes across in the very eloquent responses. But when you're describing like this lesser known side of St. Francis, it made me think of your podcast name, Holy Rebels. But this concept of freedom is interesting. Last week, I spoke to a practitioner of Tibetan yoga, and he was saying that his teacher used to refer to our bodies as Airbnbs, like something we're just renting for a time, right? And then we move out of it. But the last few people I've spoken to for this podcast, the term freedom keeps coming up, and it keeps coming up in the context of sort of like that's how they think of freedom, or sorry, freedom is how they think of play in maybe like a spiritual context, for exactly the reasons you're describing. And so, sort of transitioning to the next question, with these themes of freedom and sort of like facing mortality, you actually share something very interesting with the director of UEF, Universal Enlightenment and Flourishing, which is a kind of life-altering near-death experience that I'm sure was very traumatic in the moment, right? But in retrospect, seems to have afforded you that sense of freedom, or maybe like a greater appreciation for it, and willingness to pursue it. And so I'm hoping you can tell us a bit about that experience, whatever you're comfortable sharing, and how that's reshaped your views on what you need to flourish.
Yes. Well, in my early 20s, I was suddenly diagnosed with connective tissue cancer. And it was a scary prognosis because the tumor had hemorrhaged. And I've said this before, and people are always startled by it, but it is true. It was simultaneously the worst day of my life and also the best day of my life. The worst day, obviously, for all the reasons you can imagine, but the best because something became so clear to me that afternoon when I was diagnosed that I probably wouldn't have seen otherwise. And it had to do with prayer, of all things. My first instinct was naturally to pray for the cancer to go away. Please, God, take this from me. But I didn't want to say that prayer. Something in me stopped me from saying that prayer because by the grace of God, I recognized underneath that desire was simply my own preference to be healthy, which is, of course, completely human and completely legitimate. But I realized that wanting a long, comfortable life is a luxury that most people throughout history haven't received. And somehow connecting my suffering to the long trajectory of everyone who had come before was comforting because it normalized what I was going through rather than imagining this is something tragic that wasn't supposed to happen. And even when I talk about it now, it's quite challenging because, of course, it's natural and obvious to want to live because we honor and love being alive.
Mm-hmm.
But instead of praying, God, please make this cancer go away, I had this thought that is completely outside of the norm, which is, if I'm cured tomorrow, would it actually help my soul flourish?
Hmm.
Would it make me more loving? If I was cured, would it make me become a more honest, more compassionate, more awake person? And the truthful answer in that moment was no, because being handed my old life back would have been kind of like going backwards.
Hmm.
So it's not that I didn't want to survive. I did, but I wanted more than that. I wanted to flourish. And anyway, I didn't dare to pray for survival because I genuinely didn't know if it was meant for me.
Hmm.
So instead, I kind of realized that what hurts more than any physical pain is the resistance to the pain. And what hurts more than dying is the fear of dying itself. So the clenching against reality is actually the thing that hurts more. And what hurts less is the surrender to the unknown, even when the unknown is the scariest unknown there is, which is death. And so something very strange happened to me, which is that the moment that it fully dawned on me how helpless I truly was and how little control I had over any of this, I felt something that can only be described as joy.
Hmm.
Because suddenly I could see my options clearly. I could spend whatever time I had left dying of fear, or I could be brave and face what was actually in front of me and really enjoy the things that are left to be enjoyed. And that was the whole choice. And once you see it that starkly, it's really not a choice that's difficult. And there's a story that I actually held on to through my treatment about Francis. And it comes from a little medieval collection called The Little Flowers of St. Francis. And it's a beautiful story. Do you mind if I tell it?
Go for it, please.
So the story goes that Francis and his friend Leo are walking on a frozen road in the dead of winter. And they're walking from the city of Perugia back to their little chapel in the woods, the Porziuncola. You know, it's the middle of winter, so you can imagine the wind is brutal. They're barefoot. They're just in their little brown woolen tunics, and, you know, their feet have gone numb from the snow. And Francis, who is somehow full of energy despite it all, he turns around towards, you know, his frozen friend shivering, and he says, Leo, make a note of this. If every friar in the world became a perfect example of holiness, that would not be perfect joy. And Leo doesn't say anything. They keep walking. And a while later, Francis turns again and he says, Leo, if we could heal the sick, if we could make the lame walk, give sight to the blind, even raise the dead, Leo, that would not be perfect joy. And Leo kind of shrugs, where's this coming from? And they trudge on. And then for a third time, Francis turns around and says, Leo, if I could speak every language and read the secrets of every human heart, that wouldn't be perfect joy either. And finally, Leo kind of snaps and he says, for heaven's sake, Francis, what is perfect joy? And Francis says, Leo, imagine when we arrive home finally tonight, soaked and filthy and starving and half frozen. Imagine we knock on our door and one of the brothers inside answers and doesn't recognize us. And he thinks that we're imposters and he won't let us in. And he leaves us out in the snow. And then imagine he comes out and beats us and drives us away into the cold and into the dark. Leo, if we can endure that from people who are supposed to love us, without bitterness, if we can lie in the snow, hurt and rejected, and still, in that very moment, find room in our hearts to think of the suffering of others, then, Leo, that is perfect joy.
Wow.
Yeah,
Powerful stuff.
it is. And I want to be careful because, Francis, this can be easily misheard. Francis is not romanticizing suffering here.
Yeah, yeah.
He's not telling anyone to seek out abuse. That's not the point at all. The
Hmm.
point is that the deepest joy is not attached to a single external outcome. It's not attached to success or a recognition or to comfort or even to health, not even to be treated fairly. Perfect joy is what's left when you're so rooted in God that no outside circumstance can disturb the love in your heart. Joy is the capacity to stay in love when everything else has been stripped away. And this kind of ties back to your question about flourishing, because I think we tend to use these words, joy and happiness, as if they're the same thing, but they're really not.
Yes.
Happiness is like what the body feels, what we feel when the world cooperates. It's when the good news arrives or the scan comes back clean or the to-do list is done, and it's lovely, but it's completely dependent on circumstances.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
And for that reason, temporary, right? Um,
yeah.
ephemeral, like these things you say, like the things that you own us, right? I mean, even something like happiness, if you're too attached to it, can be kind of the same way. And you know, I think in the same way that you sort of describe like the greatest joys are like not these external material things, it's like something more inward too, right? And sort of in a similar vein, like the maybe like most, I guess during your illness, one of the things it seems like you realized was that your greatest obstacle towards flourishing was not necessarily like this external thing of sickness, but something internal as well, right? And it's something that we place a lot of emphasis on at Universal Enlightenment and Flourishing is pointing that out, right? That um, the obstacles to flourishing are not the things we think they are. It's not like we don't have enough money, um, or even maybe like we're not healthy enough, right? Those are things worth having. They can help contribute to flourishing, right? But they themselves will not be the perfect joy or the perfect flourishing. And so we talk about what we call means ends inversion, sort of placing too much value on something that should be treated as a means, treating it more as an end. And it does have that effect. Something like money, of, if you think this is like the ultimate thing I need to chase after, then the more that you own it, the more you're going to be owned by it, right?
Mhm.
And so I say all that to sort of preface, let's talk about Saint Ignatius. Um, so Saint Ignatius is the founder of the Jesuit order. Um, he actually came up a couple of episodes ago when I had on a Jesuit priest and Harvard professor with me. But I know the story of Saint Ignatius is quite dear to you, and has some similar threads to your own story, right? So sort of external circumstances that I'm sure were quite physically painful, and sort of sparking these more internal realizations. And ultimately, out of that comes this set of spiritual practices that have endured over the ages. So, one, I'm hoping you can tell us the story of St. Ignatius, and two, um, how his exercises for spiritual discernment maybe can help people um, not only clear out these obstacles to flourishing, but really like recognize them in the first place, right? You can't really fix something that's wrong or in the way of flourishing until you see that it's there.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, I like what you said about joy being free from circumstance. It's really what the soul feels when you cooperate with something larger, no matter what the external world is doing. And Ignatius is a perfect example of that. He
Hmm.
was Ignatius was a Spanish soldier and a nobleman, 16th century, and he had built his entire identity on ambition and military glory and fine clothes and the approval of the court. And then, in an instant, it was all taken away at a battle in Pamplona when a cannonball hit his leg and totally shattered it. His career was at that point finished in an instant, and his whole sense of who he was collapsed. And he spent months bedridden, recovering. And, he was very bored because the only two books in the house were The Life of Christ and a collection of stories about the saints. And he was not a religious man at that time at all, but with nothing else to do, he read those books. And he started to notice something that eventually really changed his life, because he read these books and he daydreamed, and that's all he did. And when he daydreamed about his old life, the glories of conquests, winning a battle, it would thrill him for a while. And then it would kind of leave him feeling restless and dry and a little empty. But when he imagined giving his life to something larger, like the saints he was reading about, that good feeling he felt when he daydreamed about that, it stayed, and it left him feeling peaceful and expansive. So his daydreams had two completely different aftertastes. And Ignatius had the genius to pay attention to that difference. He realized the feeling that comes after a thought is information, and that you can actually learn to read your own interior life like a compass, and that God is speaking to you through that compass all the time, through what leaves you feeling more alive and what leaves you feeling hollow. And so when Ignatius was well enough, he walked to the mountain, a monastery of Montserrat in the south of Spain near Barcelona. And he spent a whole night in prayer in front of the Black Madonna. And at dawn, he laid his sword down on the altar, declaring, "I am no longer a man of the sword. Now I am a man of God." And he gave the rest of his life to teaching people how to make this distinction between what draws you toward love and what pulls you away from love, and help people really make wise, discerning life choices. And that is the heart of Ignatian spirituality.
Great. On the topic of St. Ignatius, I know one of the most popular tours that you do for Dancing Spirit tours is the one where you walk the Camino, where you walk the path that St. Ignatius walked through the Basque region of Spain, right? And so I wanted to talk a bit more about Dancing Spirits. It's a travel company you co-founded with your father, right? On its own, I think that says a lot about that being rooted in a place of love for you. But it's also, by the name, it's Dancing Spirits tours, right? It's not like solemn spirit tours. There's something playful about it to you, obviously. So I'm wondering what is that exactly? What's the element of play in these tours? What's the purpose of it being something playful, and how do you actually inject that into these experiences that you give people?
Yeah, the spirit of play is in our name because it's the heart of how we understand the spiritual life. But let me start for a moment with my father, because this is so core to the creation of Dancing Spirit Tours. When Mother Teresa received the Nobel Peace Prize, someone asked her, "What can we do to promote world peace?" And she said, "Go home and love your family." And I think about that all the time, because Dancing Spirit Tours came out of a healing process that my family went through as individuals. My cancer journey and recovering from that. And also my dad had a major transformation in his life when he retired in the same year from a corporate job. Neither my dad nor I sat down one day and decided to start a travel company. This path really found us because we kept answering divine invitations. One yes led to another. And at some point, we just kind of realized that all the yeses had become this organization that changes people's lives by exploring meaning and connection and joy. And so, yes, the name Dancing Spirit Tours is completely deliberate. And it actually, on another level, it comes from the performing arts, because I grew up in the performing arts and I worked professionally in that industry until I got cancer. And I made my living literally creating plays. And talk about play, you know? And when the illness ended my career, I thought that playing part of my life was over. It turns out that was just the rehearsal, because what I discovered when I crossed over from the theater world to the spiritual world is that they actually run on the same three ingredients, which are community and open-heartedness and curiosity. Those three things are what makes a play come alive, and they're exactly what makes a pilgrimage come alive too. Because in both cases, you're asking people to show up, to drop the performance of who they usually are, and to become genuinely curious about what will happen next. So the theater trained me for this work more directly than any postulancy could ever have. And my pilgrims, they really remind me that over and over again, because they have this desire to play. You know, adults want to play too. The longing we had as children is right there, fully intact. And we're often just waiting for permission. You know, somewhere along the way, we absorbed this idea that reverence means hushed voices and solemn faces, you know? So what we do at Dancing Spirit is we provide pilgrims this container to flourish. And we start building that container from the very first hour. At the welcome orientation, we sit in a circle and everyone talks about why they came. And it's that stating of their intention for travel that really distinguishes a pilgrim from a tourist. And something remarkable really happens when you speak your intention, the thing that's in your heart, out loud in a circle of people who are doing the same. Strangers stop being strangers, you know, and the third day comes and everybody is laughing together and someone spontaneously starts singing on the bus or like dancing in a stone circle, and everyone joins in, and it feels holy because it is. It's freeing to be in wonder and to allow life to delight you again the way that it did when we were kids. So that's why we're called Dancing Spirit Tours.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, you know, you speak about this like tripartite system you have there. And it obviously maps on quite closely with like our system of love, learn, play. Right. And I think speaks to the fact that, you know, something in pursuit of flourishing, right? It takes a lot of integration of different disciplines, different aspects of life. And I can't pronounce French to save my life, but let's talk about Teilhard de Chardin, who I think is a great example of this, right? As someone who was a priest, was a scientist, and integrated, I think, love, learn, and play in his own way, and is the author of a quote that we like to bandy about here at UEF, which I'm sure you're familiar with, which is someday, after mastering the winds, the waves, the tides, and gravity, we shall harness for God the energies of love. And then for a second time in the history of the world, man will have discovered fire. So tell me what that quote means to you, and tell me what, if anything, you learned about flourishing or love or learning or play from Teilhard. And please, for everyone else, pronounce his name better than I did.
Well, pretty good, Alan. Pretty good. Teilhard de Chardin. Teilhard de Chardin. My French pronunciation also isn't perfect, so here we are. I love that quote. And so many people love Teilhard because he is the scientist who also believed in God. So he's like proof that you can have both. Teilhard helped me understand a cultural wound that most of us carry without even knowing it. Now, we've all inherited a worldview that draws a line straight down the middle of reality, where you have matter on one side and spirit on the other. You have the body here and the soul over there. We treat the physical world as a kind of inert backdrop, and we act as if God is somewhere beyond where we are. And people often trace this to Descartes, I think, therefore I am. And this is a mantra of devastating consequences because it's moved the whole human self up into the mind, and it's turned the body and the material world into a sort of machine. But the story, of course, is even older than Descartes. It runs all the way back through Plato, who taught that this material world is just a faint shadow of some truer realm. And the story is even older than that. There's the story of Adam and Eve, of course, which is that story of separation. Two people who once walked in seamless intimacy with the soil and the animals and the divine presence moving through all of it. And then somehow they're covering their bodies and they're hiding, and the ground itself goes hard beneath them, and the gates of that garden close. This is our story because we've been carrying that ache of division for a very long time. And Teilhard really spent his whole life closing that gap. He was a paleontologist. So he was out in the desert with his hands in the dirt, digging up bones. And what he found there was God in the dirt. And he wrote about the whole world being charged with the divine. And that we are, in his words, steeped in God's burning layers. God is not above the world watching it run. God is the deepest dimension of the world itself. And I love that. And it illustrates a theological principle that Teilhard was pointing at that's often attributed to Franciscanism, which is called the univocity of being. It means that there's only one single reality, and that everything that exists is participating in that one reality. So, for example, when we say a stone exists and we say God exists, it's the same existence at infinitely different depths. So the holiness in a stone and the holiness in a saint is the same holiness, just at different intensities. And, it's why the incarnation is such a beautiful story, because it's trying to tell us about the univocity of being all along. In Jesus, God didn't just visit the world. God revealed that God had been there the whole time, in the world, as the world, since the beginning. And once that concept becomes real to you, not as an idea, but as something you actually feel in your life, then your understanding of human flourishing completely changes. Because the sacred is like no longer something you have to escape to. There's no ordinary moment that you have to get through on your way to a holy moment. And it allows you to see the face of the person across from you, or the food on your plate, or the breath in your body, as a medium that God is reaching you through. And I guess that's the thing that Teilhard is pointing out to us about human flourishing. You don't wait for the holy to arrive. You just realize that you're already bathed in the holy this whole time.
Yeah, that's beautiful. So clearly, your sense of spirituality, your spiritual path, it's rooted in these Christian traditions, right? But um, in your other work, that sort of complements Dancing Spirit, you do a lot of educational work through online courses and things of that nature. But you're not teaching people Christianity. You're teaching people Christian mysticism, and the wisdom of the mystics, right? And I think the reason that distinction is important and worth pointing out is sort of along the lines of how that last question began, right? It's mysticism is in many religious traditions this sort of orientation that seeks to break down barriers and cross boundaries and see spirituality in a more expansive view, right? Um, so I think mysticism is something that I think we both agree on this is something that can be actually beneficial to a lot of modern day problems of sort of um, this absence of meaning and kind of outgrowing the older systems of meaning making that maybe many of us were born into or that were kind of molded around a very different kind of world. Um, and so I'm curious what your take is on what exactly a mystic is or what mysticism is. And then in what ways do you think it can kind of reorient the ways that people engage with spirituality in a way that's not traumatic, not dogmatic, but actually more expansive and conducive to flourishing?
Yes, there's different types of mysticism in every religious tradition, but in some ways, religion and mysticism have little to do with one another at the start.
Hmm.
Because a mystic is someone for whom God has stopped being a concept and become an experience.
Hmm.
Most of us inherit our faith secondhand. So we're handed beliefs about God the way that we're handed like a family recipe, and the risk is that we can carry those beliefs our whole lives without ever really tasting the dish itself. And there's
Hmm.
such a difference between a recipe as it's written and the taste of this delicious home cooked meal. Same is true with religion and mysticism. The mystic is the one who tastes the dish. So you have mystics in the Christian tradition like Teresa of Avila and John of the Cross, Hildegard of Bingen, Julian of Norwich, of course, Francis of Assisi and Ignatius of Loyola. And what sets them apart is the direct encounter. They felt God the way that you can undeniably feel when the sunshine hits your face. And it's like warm and immediate and personal. And once that happens to a person, your entire life reorganizes itself around the experience. And I know this because, it happened to me. I wasn't a follower of any faith, and I didn't really come to the mystics through religion. I actually came to religion through the mystics. And I've learned that this is actually a quite common story because for so many people today, the mystics are like a doorway back in because they're examples of living your life on purpose. And that, can be broken down to these core principles that you're talking about, like reorientation. How can mysticism reorient your life towards flourishing?
Hmm.
Well, so many people are carrying a version of spirituality that's boring to them, or a version of spirituality that has shamed them, or simply just never touched their heart. And I watch mysticism reorient that relationship in a few ways. And I would say the first way is what we've been discussing, this concept of from secondhand to firsthand. So you stop relating to God through other people's reports and you start seeking your own encounter. Instead of trying to believe in something, you learn to pay attention to what's in front of you. And then the second shift is this shift from earning love to experiencing love. So many of us inherit a faith that functions like school, follow the rules, accumulate merit, hope your good deeds outweigh your bad ones. Well, this is a misunderstanding. The spiritual life is not a test of whether you are good enough. It's a relationship where you become present to the life force of the universe, loving you unconditionally in real time. This single shift heals what most people find so painful about religion. And I think once you soften into this perspective, then you can allow for the third shift, which is this shift from striving to grace. Because modern spirituality, so easily can become one more self-improvement project, one more area of your life to optimize. You have religion, which is like all the rules, and then you have often what New Age spirituality is like a self-improvement project. Mm-hmm. The mystics, they actually start from the opposite premise. They start from grace. Grace means that God moves toward you first. So the question changes from, what do I need to fix about myself, to what is God already doing in my life, and how am I being invited to respond? And I watch that question really take weight off people's shoulders.
Yeah.
And it is so amazing because it's like a self-acceptance, and it's like a true openness to receiving rather than being stuck in like doing. And then I guess the fourth shift, this reorientation, is that the mystical life is learnable. Like, I think sometimes there's this misconception that a mystical experience is like lightning and it strikes a lucky few and then it passes over everyone else. And of course, there are people who have these like crucial moments, like I did with illness. But the mystics themselves say otherwise. They say that awakening is rarely spontaneous, that it is actually formed over time through practice. And the mystics left a map for us to follow. They left practices, ways of praying, ways of listening that you can actually repeat, like any skill that you can learn. And you don't have to improvise your inner life or leave it to chance. And this is something that you can do in any religious tradition. Every religious tradition has a level of mysticism to explore and dip into. And, I want to say something about religion itself, because I, of course, am a Franciscan sister, and I love my tradition. The mystics, first and foremost, were never people who walked away from tradition. They were the ones who went the deepest in. They took tradition so seriously that if something didn't make sense, if something seemed incongruent, they questioned it, and they insisted on finding the truth at the center of the tradition. And I think that's what these ancient traditions really are. It's like vaults of wisdom carried by communities across centuries. And the mystical tradition of every religious institution it's like the vault that's waiting for you to stop admiring it and just to open it and find the treasure inside. But you need to look.
Yeah, wow. There's a lot I could unpack there, and it would take a lot of time. So I'm going to confine myself to two things. One is that almost as soon as you said the word sunshine at the very beginning of that answer, it started thundering here, and I don't know what to make of that, but that was funny. And the second thing is, just there's I like what you said about looking for ways that God is already present in your life, and to sort of translate that to this love, learn, play framework we have, right? We talk about it as like the love, learn, play mindset. It's a mindset. It's not like you have to, um, sign yourself up for all these new activities or new programs or like do anything new, really, right? It's a lot simpler than that. Loving, learning, and playing, these are all things that are at the very core of who we are. We're all doing them all the time, like whether we are trying to or realize it or not. I think maybe the simplest place to start if you want to flourish more in life is just trying to, asking yourself, like, where does love already show up in my life? Whether that's the love I'm giving, the love I'm receiving, where does learning show up? Like, what am I learning every day? Am I teaching other people? And same thing with playing, right? And just kind of reflecting upon like how do these things make me feel, and from there, it's like just do more of that, right? But I think it does start from this place of like taking inventory of what's already going on rather than just like doing a bunch of new things. So anyway, I just kind of wanted to like wrap a bow around that thought. Um, and as we come to the close of our time here, I just want to invite you. Um, I know you're always up to a lot of things. You've always got a lot going on. So I don't really know what's on the agenda these days, but maybe you can highlight like a few things you've got coming up, whether that's a tour that you're excited about or a class that you're offering, how people can find out about that and sign up for those kinds of things, and why you think that people might benefit from that.
Well, you can find me at mysticalspirituality.com to explore a variety of online courses that we're offering about the mystics, and also perhaps to consider joining me on a sacred journey. We have 3 exciting journeys coming up. So one is to France about the divine feminine and Mary Magdalene and the Cathars. And another journey is walking in the footsteps of St. Ignatius of Loyola. That's on the Camino in Spain. And then a third is to Italy to follow in the footsteps of St. Francis and St. Clare of Assisi. And I guess for your listeners who perhaps are new to this concept of mysticism, while you're on the website, take the free quiz. It's called Who is Your Mystic Mentor? It's fun. It's totally free, and it gives you a great introduction to who the mystics were and what they can offer you in terms of helping you learn, love, and play more in your life. Oh, and you can also find me on the Holy Rebels podcast. So anywhere you listen to podcasts, find me there. I'm also on Instagram, Nina Hirlaender, OFS.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time, Nina. Thank you for regaling us with all your stories and wonderful insights. And I really appreciate you being here.
Thank you so much, Alan. What a fun way to connect and get to explore these subjects. I'm so excited for this project and so interested in hearing all the other interviews that you've conducted. You're a great friend. Thank you so much, Alan.
Of course, my pleasure.